Thank you everyone for coming here tonight. My name again is Barry Rogers, Director of Innovation, Teaching, and Learning. And we are so excited to have Catherine Sanderson here today as our speaker. As many of you know, this has also been our WPSF book read, The Positive Shift. A little bit about Catherine. So she is a Polar Family Professor and Chair of Psychology at Amherst College. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology with specialization in health and development from Stanford University. Received both master's doctoral degree in psychology from Princeton University. So she has all of the degrees we all love, but I'll tell you, just talking, she is the most down-to-earth person you'll ever meet. So that's something I really appreciate. Her research has received grant funding from National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health. She's published over 25 journals, articles, and book chapters, and most notably, The Positive Shift. Tonight, she's going to talk to us about resilience and really how to navigate these very interesting times. But without further ado, again, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Catherine, for coming to Winnetka tonight.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Just about 14 months ago now, on a Monday evening, Monday, March 9th, an email went out very broadly at my institution, Amherst College. It went to students and faculty and staff at around 8:30 p.m. And the email said, "We are moving fully remote because of the pandemic. So faculty should prepare to move to online teaching. Students should pack up their dorms and go home. They will not come back the rest of this academic year. And we are moving to an entirely remote campus." So students were, as I'm sure you can imagine, understandably very upset. And I gave my seniors a couple of weeks to just sort of settle in, get situated back home. And then I started reaching out. And in particular, I reached out personally to all of my thesis students. And I said, "Hey, just checking in, that thesis is still due and, wanting to know when I might see something, et cetera." And I got back immediately an email from one of my very strongest students, Eliza. And Eliza wrote back right away. And she said, "Hi, Professor Sanderson. I have to be honest. I haven't worked at all on my thesis since I left campus because every time that I try to get started, I open my laptop and I am just overcome by a sense of loss and grief. And it makes me unbearably sad and I just can't write." So I emailed Eliza back and I said, "Hey, let's set up a time to talk." And we set up a time to talk. We talked, we got her on a path. She finished, she did a wonderful thesis, and she is now gainfully employed and a college graduate. But that conversation with Eliza was actually the prompt for the talk that I'm giving you today, which I literally developed last April as the world, of course, changed substantially. And it's a talk about what we know about the science of resilience. And one of the most important things that the field of psychology has demonstrated within the last few years is that people who have experienced between 2 and 6 adverse events actually are higher in happiness than people who've experienced no bad events or just one. So experiencing some adversity seems to be beneficial in terms of happiness, which might seem quite surprising. Many of us might assume, well, surely people who've experienced no bad event or only one bad event, they must be happier. But that's not, in fact, what the scientific research says. And I'm going to turn now to talk about a really important finding, which is about resilience. So in psychology, we talk about resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of all different kinds of adversity. Could be trauma, could be tragedy, could be a threat, or any kind of significant source of stress. And this could be at a personal level, could be family or relationship problem, but it could also be a health problem, an injury or an illness. It could be a financial problem, getting fired or getting divorced. For a student, it could be, failing a test. So what we know, though, in psychology is that experiencing adversity is often associated with negative outcomes. That everyone listening today has heard about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And you've heard about it because PTSD is associated with lots of different kinds of negative physical and psychological outcomes. But what you may be less familiar with is something called post-traumatic growth. And what the research tells us is that experiencing some adversity actually gives us an opportunity to grow and change and develop. And there's the challenge of doing talks at home. Those are my dogs. So what the research in psychology tells us is that experiencing some kinds of adversity actually gives us an opportunity to do post-traumatic growth, which is to grow and change in fundamental ways. And I'm now going to give you a quiz, but it's ungraded. But I'm going to give you a set of items. And for each of these, I want you to think for yourself whether this is true or false, and give yourself a point anytime it's true. Then I'm going to give you a poll question and have you report your score anonymously so we can see how everybody's doing. I changed my priorities about what is important in life. So again, you can think about the last year and the coronavirus pandemic, but you can honestly think about any kind of significant personal or professional stressor that you might have faced. I changed my priorities about what is important in life. I have a greater appreciation for the value of my own life. I am able to do better things with my life. I have a better understanding of spiritual matters. I have a greater sense of closeness with others. I established a new path for my life. I know better that I can handle difficulties. I have a stronger religious faith. I discovered that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I learned a great deal about how wonderful people are. Now, take a minute. Eventually, they are going to stop. Think there's a package being delivered, but I want you to add up your score. And now I'm going to give you a chance to share what your score was. Again, anywhere between 1 and 10. And I'm going to give you 20 seconds. Then I'm going to reveal overall findings from lots of different groups that I've done this for in the last year. So 37% of you have voted already. And again, make sure you pull down the answers to the bottom, because you can in fact go all the way to 10. And now I am at 48%. And wait, is there a question? Is there a question? I think. Can that person unmute themselves and or put it in the chat room? I'm now at 48% of you. So I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to show you your answers. So here we are. And so what you can see here now is that there is a tremendous range of people today who participated. One person wrote 1, one person wrote 10, but the mean score was right around 8. That's what the most people wrote, so around 31%. And so I've been doing this talk across the country. I've been doing it for teachers, I've done it for lawyers, I've done it for high school students, I've done it for moms, I've done it for lots of different groups. And what you see overwhelmingly is a huge range, that there are people who report experiencing lots of post-traumatic growth, and there are people who report experiencing not so much post-traumatic growth. But on average, in the last year, people have been at sort of 6, 7, 8. That those are the sort of responses I'm seeing again and again. And this is a really important finding, because what this tells us is that experiencing some kind of adversity, in fact, gives us an opportunity to grow and change in really important ways. So I now want to turn to why. What is it about experiencing some kind of adversity that gives us an opportunity to do that sort of growth? And there are 3 consistent findings. 1, what we know is that experiencing adversity helps us appreciate and savor the small joys of daily life. There's a wonderful scale in psychology. It's called the savoring scale. And what the scale basically measures is the extent to which you really savor and appreciate small moments. So let's say I gave you a giant piece of chocolate. You could break off a piece, chew it, swallow it, be done. Or you could savor it. You could break off a piece, you could smell the aroma, you could put that small piece on your tongue, you could have the flavors waft over your taste buds, you could swallow it and enjoy the aftertaste. Again, you could really savor the experience of eating that chocolate. So, what the research in psychology tells us is that people who have been through some kind of adversity have a much greater appreciation for the small joys of daily life. They basically savor the small moments that many people, most people, take for granted. When I was teaching last spring, when my school went remote, I was teaching a class that met at 8:30 in the morning. And for college students, 8:30 in the morning is like obscenely early. And they would drag themselves into class, but they would look, really disheveled and, not showered and baseball hats on. And they never looked happy to see me or to see each other. After we went to remote learning, I had so many students reach out and say, I miss you. I miss sitting in that lecture hall with all of my classmates. I really miss being there. And they had not appreciated me for being in that lecture hall at 8:30 in the morning ever before. But all of a sudden, they really recognized the small joys of daily life. Shortly after the pandemic started last year, my family, I had two sons in college and a daughter in high school. We were having dinner and we all went around the table and said, what will you look forward to when life gets back to normal? And one of my sons said he couldn't wait to be back at college with, his fraternity friends. The husband said, I can't wait to find toilet paper when I go to Walmart, again, that would be easy. I think for me, it was like being able to go to Starbucks without wearing a mask. And again, those are all examples of things that are just tiny little moments that we may in fact have a greater appreciation for after having gone through this pandemic, for example. Another consistent finding, adversity builds compassion. People who have undergone difficult experiences overwhelmingly report feeling greater compassion for those around us. This picture I know is a really difficult one, but it's an iconic image from the Boston Marathon bombings a few years ago. And what happened in that explosions, as you remember, is that 2 bombs went off and people had no idea how many more explosions were going to happen. So many people ran and hid for their lives. They were terrified. But one man, the man in the cowboy hat, he did something quite different. Instead, he ran towards a person who was severely injured, this young man whose legs had been destroyed in one of the bomb explosions. A reporter later asked him, Carlos, the man in the cowboy hat, how did you have the courage to rush in and try to help when you had no idea if there would be other explosions? And this is what he said. I've lost 2 sons, one during times of war and another to suicide. I just didn't want any other families to experience that kind of loss. So his rushing to help that young man, stopping the bleeding, getting him prompt medical attention, probably saved his life. And I'm hopeful that we will return from the pandemic to a new normal in which people are kinder, in which people are nicer, because we've all gone through something really, really difficult, and we've all gone through it together in some sense. And it's very possible that that experience of adversity will, in fact, let us feel more compassion for those around us. Adversity builds resilience. Many colleges and universities have a first-year orientation program in which they send out incoming students on some kind of like outward bound camping, hiking sort of trip. And one of the key reasons they do that is that those trips are, in fact, themselves kind of a low-level adverse experience. People are freaked out. Am I going to get along with these other people? Are we going to successfully start a fire? Are we going to have enough food to eat? Is it all going to be okay? And then they get through it and it is okay. And that experience of some kind of low-level adversity actually gives them more resilience and a better ability to cope when things maybe don't go so smoothly during the first semester at college, when you get a C on your first midterm, when your romantic partner breaks up with you, when you don't get that internship you really wanted. And what the research tells us is that actually experiencing some adversity helps college students be able to withstand future difficult events. One of my most meaningful roles as a faculty member at Amherst College is I am the faculty advisor for a cancer support group. These are students whose lives have been touched in some way by cancer. Some of them have been in treatment for cancer themselves. Some of them have a parent who's in treatment. Some of them have lost a parent or sibling to cancer. So these are kids who've been through some stuff. Before the pandemic, we used to meet in my living room, and we met in my living room about once a month because, in all honesty, the kids sometimes cried and they preferred to do so at my house than in a dorm lounge on campus. After my school went remote, we started meeting on Zoom. And what was amazing to me was how good these kids were doing. Because you know what? Going to remote college and a global pandemic were not the worst things that had ever happened to them. Their peers were worried about, my lacrosse season is canceled and, I can't go to Italy this summer. And these kids were like, yeah, the pandemic, it's not that big a deal. I've been through worse. And that's really a vivid example of how adversity can, in fact, build resilience in really important ways. And I want to turn now to talk about specific strategies that we can use for finding happiness, even in the midst of adversity. Now, this could be adversity like a global pandemic, but it could also be other kinds of adversity. It could be getting rejected from a job you wanted or the dream college. It could be managing any kind of personal or professional or academic crisis. That there are things that we can do in the midst of all different kinds of adversity that can let us find happiness again, maybe not instantly, but over time. And they are things that are within our control. Now, there's a wonderful quote by the author Elizabeth Gilbert that profoundly speaks to the role that each of us have in expending time and energy and effort in trying to find happiness. Many people, maybe most people, think about happiness as something that happens automatically. Maybe we are born happy, or that happiness is a matter of winning the lottery or having something really lucky happen to you. But for most people, happiness isn't accidental, and it's not based on our genes. It actually involves effort, deciding that we want to be happy, we deserve to be happy, and being willing to spend time and energy and effort in ways that, in fact, pay off. As Elizabeth Gilbert says, happiness is the consequence of personal effort. You fight for it, strive for it, insist upon it, and sometimes even travel around the world looking for it. You have to participate relentlessly in the manifestations of your own blessings. And once you have achieved a state of happiness, you must never become lax about maintaining it. You must make a mighty effort to keep swimming upward into that happiness forever, to stay afloat on top of it. And one of the most important findings about expending this effort is that you need to avoid comparisons. And this is really hard. And it's particularly hard if you live in a place like Winnetka. It's particularly hard if you work at a place like Amherst College, that comparisons are all around us. And what we often see is that many people feel pretty happy with their own lives, right up until when they start comparing their lives to others around them. As this cartoon says, I do count my blessings, but then I end up counting those of others who have more and better blessings, and that pisses me off. Or as Teddy Roosevelt said more concisely, comparison is the thief of joy. And one of the things that makes this one, I think, so tricky these days is the presence of social media, or what I like to call fake book, in which many people post about only the good. My kid is valedictorian. I just ran the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours. Again. Our whole family went to Tahiti for 3 weeks and loved each other the whole time. And so it can be really hard spending time on social media for us, for our children. And so one of the key findings in the research on the science of happiness is that reducing time on social media, or keeping in mind that what people post is not an autobiographical rendition of their lives, it's what they're choosing to post. And I have Lots of other thoughts about social media, good and bad. If anybody wants to talk more about that in the Q&A, think about your question, and I'm glad to take that in the chat room at the end, and I've got lots to say. But I want to turn now to 5 specific strategies that empirical scientific research tells us, in fact, can lead to better happiness, even in the midst of trying times. 1, foster wellness. Now, we often think about wellness, and rightly so, as being really important for physical health. And it is, of course, important for physical health. But wellness is also really important for psychological well-being. People who exercise experience higher levels of physical well-being, but also higher levels of psychological well-being. So finding some way of staying fit and active, whether that's jogging or taking a yoga class or playing tennis or golf, being physically active is a really important part of psychological health. Now, in the pre-pandemic days, when I used to give talks to big audiences in crowded hotel ballrooms, I would say, who here exercises regularly? And lots of people would raise their hands. And then I would say, who here gets enough sleep? And very few people would raise their hands. And then I would say, yeah, you know, what's interesting is that sleeping is actually easier than exercising, which is FYI true. But we often don't think about sleep as an important part of wellness, and yet sleep is an extraordinarily important part of wellness. A fascinating study done by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, brought in people, measured their sleep, and then, with the people's permission, inserted a cold virus up their nostrils. And what they found was that people who had adequate sleep, about 7.5 hours or more a night, were less likely to manifest signs of the cold than those who slept fewer hours, even when the cold virus had been inserted into their nostrils. So again, sleeping is good for psychological well-being, but also physical well-being. If you don't meditate already, meditation has been very strongly associated with better psychological and physical well-being. And there's fascinating research in neuroscience that shows the mere act of meditating actually changes the structure and activity in particular parts of the brain in ways that make us not only feel happier, but also greater kindness and compassion for other people. Another really interesting and new finding. For many people, fostering wellness includes adopting or practicing religious or spiritual beliefs. You might remember from the post-traumatic growth scale I gave you earlier that many of those items, in fact, tap into the idea of religious or spiritual beliefs. And there's lots of different explanations for why having particular religious or spiritual beliefs predicts greater happiness. Again, I'm glad to talk about some of those mechanisms explaining that relationship in the Q&A. So if that interests you, make sure to ask a question about it. So foster wellness, one thing. 2, find purpose. One of the most consistent findings in the literature on the science of happiness is that people who find purpose and meaning in their lives experience higher levels of happiness. And this could be accomplishing home projects, cleaning out a closet, organizing the basement, cleaning out the garage. It could be outdoor projects, especially as it's getting nicer these days. So a gardening project is a great example of accomplishing something. For many people, that could include personal goals, such as reading a certain number of books, a bucket list of, what do I really want to read? What do I want to tackle? And one of the most consistent findings is the act of writing it down matters. So it's not just thinking about your goals. There's actually something tangible about writing down a list, crossing it off. And so I encourage you to think about ways of giving structure and purpose to your lives. And again, this can be particularly hard during the times of the pandemic in which certain activities are maybe off limits. Maybe you're not going to a book club meeting or you're not able to do volunteer work or something. It's important to find ways of structuring and finding purpose in your life. And that's also particularly true for people who are living in low control environments. Think maybe your parents or grandparents living in assisted living facilities. It's particularly important for people who may not have that natural sort of structure and purpose to find ways of imbuing their lives with meaning. 3, and this is one of my favorites, give anything to anyone. This is one of the most strongest findings in the field of positive psychology. People who give to other people experience higher levels of happiness. The graph on the top left, the map of the world, shows many, many countries, most of the world in green. Every single country that is colored in green, there is a positive correlation between charitable giving and happiness. So that means people who, in fact, donate, experience higher levels of happiness. Now, you might be wondering, this is an important question. Does that mean that giving makes people happy, or happy people give, or wealthy people give and are also happy? So to examine that question, in 20 of these countries, researchers did another study. They brought in people, they had them do a short little task in the lab. And then half of the people, they said, here is a gift bag that you get to keep to thank you for doing this study. The other people, they said, here is a gift bag that we are donating to a local hospital to thank you for participating. Then they measured the people's levels of happiness. As you could probably predict, what did they find? People were happier when their bag went to the hospital than when they got to keep it. So a powerful example of how giving, even to a stranger, makes us feel better. People who volunteer in their communities, higher levels of happiness. People who donate blood, higher levels of happiness. And this one is particularly important since in many parts of the country right now, natural blood donation drives have been shut or canceled because they can't run in hospitals or colleges or high schools. So if you're healthy and your community is in need of blood, this is a wonderful way to help the community and make you feel better. Recent research in neuroscience has found that if you just think about giving a gift to a friend, it activates a part of the brain that is in charge of processing rewarding experiences. The exact same part of the brain that is activated when you eat chocolate or use cocaine, but that's like a less healthy example. 4, spend time in nature. And this is, again, an extremely easy thing to do because what the research shows is that you don't have to move to Wyoming, that simply spending time in nature, even within an urban environment, leads to higher levels of happiness and also better physical health. One of the earliest studies to demonstrate this effect was done at a hospital in Pennsylvania. The way this hospital was set up, there were 2 wings. One wing of the hospital overlooked a parking lot. So people who were assigned to that wing saw cars and traffic and asphalt. The other wing of the hospital overlooked a lovely park. So people who were assigned to that wing saw trees and bushes and flowers and grass. So the researchers in this study looked at recovery rates from surgery. And they looked at patients who'd had the exact same surgery, but had been assigned to one of these 2 wings of the hospital. And here's what they found. Compared to people whose room overlooked the parking lot, people whose room overlooked the park got out of bed faster, needed lower amounts of pain medication, and got discharged faster from the hospital. Across every single dimension they studied, just looking at nature through a hospital window led to faster recovery from surgery. Now, you might be wondering, well, how does that happen? Like, what explains that? So to answer that question, researchers did a follow-up. They brought in people and they put them in an fMRI machine to measure brain activation. Then they showed them 2 different images. The bottom pictures on your screen right now actually show these 2 different pictures. So as you can see, one of the pictures was of a very pretty urban city skyline. The other picture was a very pretty rural nature scene. So it's not that the urban city skyline is showing, smog or graffiti or traffic. They're both visually appealing pictures. And yet, what they found was that people's brains respond in very different ways. People who looked at the urban city skyline showed lots of brain activation. The brain was active, it was firing. People who were looking at the rural nature scene showed relaxed, calm brain waves, like they were meditating or sleeping. And so this finding tells us something really important, that in fact, looking at pictures of nature is relaxing at a neurological level, and that probably helps the body devote greater resources to recovering from surgery. 5th and final point, build and maintain connections. And this is an extraordinarily important thing to remember for people of all ages. The graph on the bottom right of your screen shows a really interesting finding. It shows the link between age and happiness, which is a so-called U-shaped curve. What this U-shaped curve tells us is that people are happy in their 18 to 20s. And as I say to my college students, what the hell is there not to be happy about when you're 18 to 21? Then happiness drops like a stone right up until around age 50. Sorry, that this is hitting too close to home for some people. It is to me. But then, in what is good news for all of us, happiness increases in your 60s, 70s, and they've studied people up to age 85. And it's a very consistent finding, this U-shaped happiness curve. And it, in fact, is seen in every single country that has been studied. So it's not a uniquely American or Western culture kind of finding. So to examine why, researchers have done qualitative interviews with people at different ages. And what they find is very consistent. People in their younger years focus on having big social networks, or what I like to call Facebook friends. People in their 70s and 80s, they get rid of the riffraff and they focus on having a smaller number of relationships, but with people who they really care about and who care about them. So basically, what are they doing? Well, they're choosing quality over quantity. And that is what leads to greater happiness. There's a wonderful Peanuts cartoon that illustrates this finding perfectly. And here's what it says. As we grow up, we realize it is less important to have lots of friends and more important to have real ones. And that seems to be exactly what explains this U-shaped curve. Now, it can be hard during the times of the pandemic to focus on building and maintaining connections. So it's important to do that in deliberate ways because we know the value of building those connections is so important in terms of happiness and, frankly, physical health. My stepfather turned 85 last June, and we did a Zoom birthday party, which was not the same as, of course, being in person, but it was a wonderful celebration, a chance to join together and share stories, tell jokes, share pictures. My niece graduated from college via Zoom last weekend, and we had a family Zoom party, again, celebrating Zoe. I've been deliberately trying to work on building and maintaining connections in my Zoom teaching this year at Amherst. I start every single class the same way. Every single person goes around and shares a high or a low that they've had in the last week. And the students share all sorts of things, hi, it was my birthday and I had, this really great ice cream cake, or I got to see my dog, or I got an internship that I really wanted for the summer. And they also share lows. They've shared losing their favorite pair of sunglasses, having too much work and being really stressed, being in quarantine for COVID exposure. But here's what's fascinating. When I do year-end evaluations at the end of each semester, and I ask students, what'd you like best about the class? Virtually all of them say the same thing, high-low, which of course is nothing about psychology. What they say is, I loved hearing the highs and lows, in part because it made me feel like Professor Sanderson cared about me as a person, not just a student. And that, of course, is exactly why I'm doing it. And I want to say one more thing about building and maintaining connections. You heard my dogs bark ferociously earlier in this webinar. And here's one of the key findings. Dog owners who stare into their dog's eyes experience a boost in this chemical called oxytocin. It's often known as the love hormone or the bonding hormone. It's the same hormone that is elevated in women shortly after they give birth as a way of promoting bonding with the infant. It's also elevated in people after they have a consensual hug from someone they care about. So what the research tells us is that when dog owners stare into their dog's eyes, this chemical oxytocin is increased in our brain, so it makes us actually feel good. And your dog also experiences the same boost. So it makes you feel good, makes your dog feel good. Now, I'll just preface it before I get a question in the Q&A about this. They have not tested it with your ferret, your cat, your goldfish, your turtle, whatever. So it might work with other kind of pets, but the only thing I can speak to empirically is dogs. So I now want to go to our second poll question. I've talked about 5 different things: fostering wellness, finding purpose, giving a gift, spending time in nature, and building connections. And for this next poll, I'm asking, which of these have you done in the last 6 months? And this poll is multiple choice, meaning that you can actually choose more than one of them. You don't just have to choose your favorite. So I'll give you like a minute to give you your answers, to put in your answers, and then I will share the results. And it's been really interesting to me because, again, I've done this with lots of different groups, and the answers are all over the place in terms of what is the most common, what is the most popular. All right, so 64% of you have already voted, which is great. We've been going just about 30 seconds. I'll give you about another 20 seconds if anyone else wants to answer. We're now at 75%, which is great. Anyone else wants to get their vote in? We've now passed 80%. And in the interest of time, I'm going to give you 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to call it, and then I will share your answers. And here we go. All right, so what you can see is that giving is the thing that most people have done, which is so great. So some people reported doing each of these. Many people are doing fostering wellness and spending time in nature and building connections, and some people are focusing on finding purpose. So again, what I'm hoping today is that if you're doing some of these already, keep it up. That's really good. And maybe you have an idea or two that you've not been doing that can help you again now or in the future in terms of being resilient. I now want to turn and talk about one final key point, and that is to embrace healthy thoughts. There are some people who find it easy to always locate some kind of silver lining and to always embrace sort of the positive and optimistic view of something. And if you're one of those people, congratulations. I am like super not one of those people. And I'm struck that just about 14 months ago now, shortly after the coronavirus pandemic, really swept the country, the world, I was freaking out. And I would sit up at night and like Google, symptoms of coronavirus. And am I going to have enough toilet paper? And, oh my gosh, how are things going? And I was really freaking out and also not sleeping well. And I started getting emails and in a couple places, a couple times, like a physical letter, like in my mailbox with a stamp on it. And they were from strangers, absolute strangers, people I did not know, who had either heard me talk about the science of happiness at some point or had bought my book, The Positive Shift, which is all about positive thinking, kind of ironically. And these people would reach out and say, hey, I just wanted you to know that, I keep thinking about your talk, or your book has been so helpful. I know one person in particular said, every morning I just open your book to some random page and I just find something in it that's so helpful. And again, at the same time, I was completely freaking out. So I would say, I guess I should read that book. But anyway, but what I want to really emphasize is that even if it's not easy and natural for you to embrace a sort of positive mindset, we can all get better at doing it. And there's a wonderful quote by Nelson Mandela that really speaks to the power we all have, no matter what, to embrace this kind of optimistic outlook. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. And I want to end now by giving you one final real-world example that really illustrates the ability that we all have to maintain a positive mindset no matter what. And it's a story that happened to a young man who's a sophomore at Princeton University a number of years ago. He was walking back to his dorm one night, very drunk, it was like 3 a.m., when he climbed on top of a little electric train on the Princeton campus and grabbed the 2 electric wires above him. He was, as I'm sure you can imagine, severely electrocuted. A friend who was with him called 911. He was airlifted to a local hospital and he lived, but in the process, he lost both of his legs and one of his arms. This is a picture of him today. So he underwent extensive plastic surgery, physical therapy, eventually returned to Princeton, decided to change his major. He became pre-med. He finished Princeton, applied to medical school, and today he is a doctor living and working in San Francisco. A couple of years ago, a reporter for the Princeton Alumni Magazine asked him the question that I imagine we would all ask him if we had the opportunity to meet him. And here's the question. If you could go back in time and undo that night that has so dramatically changed your life and your body, would you do so? And here's what he said. No. Too much good stuff has come out of it. I was not headed towards a career in medicine before the accident, and I don't think I'd be as good a physician if I hadn't had that experience. And that to me is really the perfect example that He's experienced such a major sense of personal loss and trauma, and yet he's framing it as too much good stuff. He works today with quadriplegics, with paraplegics, with amputees. And what he says is, when I walk into somebody's hospital room, they look at my body and there is an immediate sense of connection and rapport. And that ability lets me be a better physician than if I hadn't had that experience. And I want to end with one final quote from a wonderful book called My Losing Season by Pat Conroy. And it's about a basketball team that loses and loses again and again and again. And the lessons that this author takes from that loss. Sports books are always about winning because winning is far more pleasurable and exhilarating to read about than losing. Winning is wonderful in every aspect, but the darker music of loss resonates on deeper, richer planes. Loss is a fiercer, more uncompromising teacher, cold-hearted but clear-eyed in its understanding that life is more dilemma than game and more trial than free pass. My acquaintance with loss has sustained me during the stormy passages of my life, when the pink slips came through the door, when the checks bounced at the bank, when I told my small children I was leaving their mother, when the despair caught up with me, when the dreams of suicide began feeling like love songs of release. Though I learned some things from the games we won that year, I learned much, much more from loss. And to me, this quote seems particularly apt these days, in which all of us have experienced major loss over the last year. Children, college students, teenagers have lost sports seasons, in-person learning, time with friends, graduations, proms. Many of us have lost long-awaited trips or summer camp or family reunions or weddings or celebrating graduations or the birth of a new baby. Many people, of course, have experienced personal loss, the loss of a loved one. And so it's very easy to focus on all that has been lost, but we also have an opportunity to focus on what we have gained. And I'm hoping that this talk has given everybody some insight into the lessons of loss, and in particular, how the experience of some adversity can help people show a greater appreciation for savoring the small joys of daily life, to be able to feel greater compassion to people around us, and to develop much needed skills and resilience that will pay off in the upcoming weeks and months and years ahead. So thank you all so much for listening. I am going to stop sharing my screen just so people can see me more and see, instead of seeing me really small. But I want to say that anyone who's listening to this now live or the recording later on, if you'd like a copy of this slide deck, just shoot me an email and I'm glad to send it right out to you if you'd like to kind of reflect back on the messages and themes that I've described. My email, I'll put in the chat room, but it's casanderson@amherst.edu. You can also watch versions of this talk or other talks I've given as I describe as a whole body talk, which sounds significantly more risque than it actually is. It's a pre-pandemic talk with my whole body, not just my head. And I'm on Instagram talking pretty regularly about happiness and health and well-being at Sanderson Speaking. And lots of this talk, as was described in the very nice introduction, is taken from my book, The Positive Shift, which is available on Audible and independent bookstores and Amazon and so on. So thank you all so much for listening. I am going to stop sharing now, but I will put in the chat room my email address and my website address. And I'm now going to turn to the chat room. If there are any questions that might have come in, I'm glad to answer those now. And if anyone has a question that they thought of, I'm absolutely fine to put that in the chat room. And again, sometimes people have a question that they don't really want to put in a chat room, or you're seeing this as a recording and I'm not live and you want to ask a question. It's absolutely fine to email me. And again, casanderson@amherst.edu or sandersonspeaking.com. You can also email me through my website directly. So thank you so much for listening. And I don't think I see any questions yet, but I am checking. Oh, wait, in the Q&A, I have a question in the Q&A. And then I have a question in the chat room. Okay, good. So one question that has been asked in the Q&A is as follows, and I'll read it aloud, which is, I have seen many people grow stronger in the face of adversity, but sometimes that doesn't happen and people come away wounded. I worry about this for children in homes that are less secure. I wonder if you can explain what tends to drive someone's response to adversity one way or the other. Really important question. Thank you so much for asking that. It's actually one that I talk about a fair amount in my book because it's a really important one. And I can say two things. One that I think is a little bit more hopeful than the other. But so what the research tells us is two things. One, there does seem to be a genetic component. So there are particular genes, and it's not just one gene, it's actually a constellation of several genes, but there are people with a particular genetic ability to be resilient. And so they've done fascinating research showing, in fact, even within children within the same family, that adversity for some people sends to just kind of send them off and put them in a slump, and they really do have trouble recovering from that. Children in the exact same circumstance, sometimes again within the exact same family, seem to be able to just kind of buffer the negative events and keep going. So there does seem to be a genetic predisposition that allows some people to cope better through adversity than others. And again, it's not just one gene, it's a constellation of genes, but the honest truth is that some people are genetically better able to be resilient in the time of adversity. However, and that's the less hopeful thing, the more hopeful thing is as follows. What is true for everybody, regardless of genetic predisposition, is that having some kind of attachment figure or bond helps. And so this could be a beloved teacher or neighbor or family member who is always in your corner. It's research in psychology has shown that having what we call a secure attachment figure, a person, a supportive relationship actually can go a tremendously long way towards helping people be resilient. And again, it doesn't have to be with a parent, doesn't have to be with a family member, could be with a neighbor, could be with a teacher, could in some cases be with a friend. There's been research showing that for high school students in particular, the presence of a best friend, a strong, consistent, supportive relationship also can help people cope with adverse events and come out of it. So the answers basically are kind of genetics, but also relationships matter, and having a support person, a person in your corner is tremendously helpful in terms of managing adversity and coming out okay and being resilient. So really important practical question. Another question that is in the chat room has been, help me understand meditation. So not totally sure of the intent of that question, but basically the idea of meditation is helping people be calm at a physical level, but more important in terms of meditation, it's helping people be calm at a neurological level and to really focus intently on being present in the moment. So there are different kinds of meditation. Mindfulness meditation is something that's gotten a fair amount of attention in the literature, but there's also kinds of meditation that focus on loving kindness meditation is another one. What seems to be particularly beneficial about meditation is that it is calming for the brain at a psychological level. There is a strong tendency, and again, this tendency may be partially genetic, it also tends to be stronger in women in general than in men, to do something called rumination. And rumination is basically like dwelling on negative. Sometimes it's, the negative reality, sometimes it's negative possibilities. And what the research shows is that rumination, not surprisingly, is really bad for you in terms of psychological well-being. It's linked with depression. It actually is a precursor to depression. And people who ruminate overwhelmingly have more difficulty sort of snapping out of it and doing some of the things that I've talked about in this webinar in terms of finding purpose, finding meaning, building relationships, and so on. So one of the ways in which meditation may be beneficial is it sort of stops or disrupts negative thought patterns that people can kind of cycle into that are detrimental. And meditation, again, focused on being in the here and now, seems to be beneficial. Another thing that works in a pretty similar way, which I didn't talk about in the interest of time today, but it's quite related, is focusing on gratitude. So focusing on gratitude is going to sleep at night thinking about 2 or 3 things that you are grateful for in your world right now. and really focusing on things that you are grateful for. And the here and now is really important. It can't be, things I'll be grateful for once I retire or once I win the lottery or, whatever. Focusing specifically on what you're grateful for right now has been shown to be tremendously beneficial. And that's true even for people who are experiencing chronic pain or chronic health conditions. So it's not just a finding for, for people who are in perfectly good health, and so on. So meditation seems to be beneficial probably for a couple of different reasons. And what I like about meditation in particular is it's really cheap, really easy, really short, in that sense. Next question, again, in the chat room, and I'm glad to answer them in the chat room or Q&A. Feel free to add them in. Next question is, not sure why more teachers don't do high-low. We use this at work and go around the table for our leadership group and ask what is in your head and what is in your heart. Oh, I love that. It really drives connections to one another. I super agree with that. And to be honest, I had never done high-low before the pandemic. So I was like, got a limited amount of time. I've got to, pump students full of knowledge. I'd never done it. And I started doing it last August when I was teaching on Zoom because I had students, all over the world. I mean, students in different time zones, students in different parts of the country, students, taking my classes in really different surroundings. And I just felt like people were so disconnected and I wanted to find a way to bring people together. And so I started doing it. And I was not really sure initially if I was going to keep doing it or do it every class. But the results from what the students said were just so consistent. And I also really feel like it created a feeling in my class, again, in my Zoom class, of connection, of rapport. Often people would sort of, report back, remember last week I couldn't find an apartment. This week I found an apartment. Or remember last week I, applied for this job. Or remember last week I, was in quarantine. Well, I'm out of quarantine. So it also was sort of a way of building connection and continuity. And to be honest, I feel like it paid off overwhelmingly in my class. And I have to now kind of think about what am I doing in the future? And maybe it will be something that I maintain in certain kinds of classes. I have to sort of think about my post-Zoom return to teaching and what I will do. But I certainly have loved it. And I think it's a wonderful way of building connection in groups of all type. As that question in the chat room says, doing it in a work environment can also be really effective. I know that my children's camp also does it in sort of cabins at night. They've often done sort of high-low activity, same kind of thing. I think they call it like mountains and valleys or something like that. Anyway, I think I've actually answered. There were only those 3 questions. I will see if there are any other questions. And if not, again, I'm glad to have people follow up later on and send me an email with a question if something occurs to you later on. Oh, another question has just come in, which is, how is religion important? And that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. So here's what's fascinating. There's a strong link between religious and spiritual beliefs and both greater happiness and greater health. Very, very consistent finding in literature. However, this is what's in debate. One school of thought says religious beliefs are often a kind of proxy for positive thinking. So many religions have beliefs that are very associated with an optimistic outlook. God won't give me more to handle than I can handle. If I pray, someone's listening. I'm going to see my loved ones in an afterlife. So those are all actually examples of positive thinking that I've described throughout this webinar. Now, there's another theory, and this is a theory, is that religious and spiritual beliefs are actually just kind of a conduit to getting us connections. That people with religious and spiritual beliefs often belong to a Bible study, a temple, a church group, some kind of other group of people. And that in fact, religious and spiritual beliefs are just a way of letting us build connections. And either of those or both of those could be right. So we know that religion is important, but we're not exactly sure which of those mechanisms explains it. And again, it could well be both. So thank you for asking that question. I find that, really a fascinating and important topic. Another question has come into the chat room. Can you talk about kids and screen time? Do you believe this would create a long-term negative effect as kids would interact with others through virtual worlds? So this is a topic that there's in fact a vicious and kind of bitter debate about within the psychological community. I have to be honest. And there's some researchers in psychology who believe that more screen time is really associated with greater anxiety and depression. There are other people who believe that it is not. And so the jury is very much still out on this question at an empirical level. So I want to be clear about that. To me, what I think is most important and what I talk about to my biological children, but also what I talk about to my college student children, is that really what is it about? It's probably not so much about screen time. It's probably really about how you use that screen time. And to me, I think the way you use the screen time is what's really important. People can use screen time in a way that makes them feel worse, makes them do the kind of comparisons that I talked about earlier. That may be particularly true for girls who are really focused on their appearance and what they look like, and how many friends do I have, and look at this stuff that I'm doing. But screen time can also be used to be authentic. I'm really struck in giving this talk today, a few days after Mother's Day. So my mother died just about 17 years ago now. And for many, many years, Mother's Day was a brutal, brutal holiday for me, because you go on social media and everybody's like, here I am, best mom ever. We're going to brunch or whatever. And it was just a day in which I missed my mom terribly, and made me feel really bad seeing all of these other, happy mothers, daughters on social media. So a few years ago, I started doing something different. On Mother's Day, I post some kind of a picture, often of me and my mom. And I say something like, I'm really missing my mom today. I am really sad. And then I tag lots of other people who have experienced the death of their mom, which of course every year is sadly more people. And what I found by doing that was, one, I felt like I was being authentic. I was being who I really am. I was expressing a sad emotion, which was very genuine. But I had many, many people respond in one of two ways. One, they shared some story. Oh, I miss your mom too. Or let me tell you about this great story about you and your mom. And I loved that kind of connection with people who also missed her. But I also had so many people who also had lost their moms who reached out and said, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that I too am missing my mom today. Thank you. And so I use that example to say that when we talk about social media and screen time, I think that it's probably not so much how much time you're doing as what purpose you are using it for. And it can be used to create really important connections, or it can be used to create really problematic comparisons. So I like to think about social media and screen time as not just how much, but what's the purpose underlying it. So really important question. Thank you for that. And now I think I have finish the Q&A and chat room. And again, the problem with asking a professor to talk is professors can talk. So I certainly don't want to overstay my welcome. I so appreciate everyone listening and the really fascinating questions that I've gotten. And again, completely fine for people to reach out if they'd like a copy of the slide deck, or a question occurs to them, or in a day or two that they'd like to reach out and ask me.
All right. Well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you so much. And in a true spirit of gratitude and happiness, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and just helping us build that toolkit for resilience and happiness. And so, fantastic. We also want to thank our Winnetka Public Schools Foundation for supporting this event and really making your message available to our community. I can't think of a better, a more relevant message to be delivered at this particular time. So thank you, and it really does support the work that we're trying to do here in District 36. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. As I'm sure everyone can tell, I love talking about psychology. And as I said to you at the beginning, Barry, more resilience in the world is good for all of us. So I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much. All right, again, it'll be available for recording. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Catherine Sanderson, author of The Positive Shift, and just for sharing just a great message with us tonight.
Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.